Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this 35th scale Schwimmwagen Trippel SG638 from Das Werk. Not only that, but I'll be answering the important question, does it float? Stick around to find out. This is a relatively new release from Das Werk, unless you are watching this way in the future, I guess. It is a bit different to the Volkswagen Schwimmwagen that I'm sure most people think of when they hear the word Schwimmwagen. I made a separate video showing the content of this box a while ago, so if you'd like to look at the sprues, go and check that out. There's a link in the description. Surely you've been able to watch that entire video in the last couple of seconds, so let's start gluing bits of plastic together. I start by assembling the wheels, and this is pretty simple. You take the rubber tyres, insert the plastic rims, and then you glue the rear rim part into place. I suppose if you wanted, you could superglue the tyres to the rims to make sure they don't move. I didn't feel like that was necessary though. I set those aside because they won't be needed for a while. I mean, there's nothing to glue them to yet, so what else are you gonna do? The suspension assemblies come next, and these were quite a bit more fiddly than I was expecting. I won't go into excruciating detail about how these go together. You should be able to see in the video anyway, and really, if you're building this, you'll probably have the instructions anyway. Though, in fairness, I also have the instructions, and still had to muddle through it a bit. The Schwimmwagen is going to look best if its wheels are vertical and not tilted at weird angles, so I would recommend paying attention to that and getting all these little bits and pieces aligned such that the wheel should be held straight. It's a little bit easier said than done. I did make a mistake on the first rear suspension unit I put together. The first bit I glued on should be a little bit higher up in the box, suspension holder. I was lucky enough to notice the problem quick enough and was able to take the part out and put it back in the correct place. You'll probably find tweezers to be quite helpful when building these, and maybe some patience too. This took a lot longer than I thought it would, but eventually I had all the suspension units together, so why not install them? There are some fairly obvious recesses for them to mount into, so it's pretty easy to do. Then, at the front, there's a pair of bars. I don't know what they're called, but they go here, and they do this. At the rear, I add a pair of hooks, and these are also pretty simple to get into place. A little bit of nudging to make sure they're on nice and straight, and jobs are good'n. Next I add a little arm thing for the propeller, and then the propeller. As you can probably see, these aren't difficult to install, though there isn't really a whole lot holding them in place, and I could see it being easy to damage these parts, or at least nudge them out of place. I didn't actually have any issues with them, but if you want to be extra careful, you could leave this step until later. I follow that by beginning work on the interior. These little angled doodads go in here. They're mounts for the transmission that will come later. I then glue the left bit of flooring into place. It's got keying and the base of the seat to guide it, so this is very easy. I then add the handbrake lever. You could try to install this first, and then work it through the floor part, but I think it'll be much easier if you put it on after the floor part is in place as I've done. I then add the flooring on the right side, which is just as easy as the left side. Now for the transmission. First, I glue this tiny little nubbin into place here. Be careful not to drop it, you'll never see it again. Then onto the end of that first assembly, the instructions seem to want you to glue this other bit of transmission. It seems to me like it would be a lot easier to glue the forward part onto the floor first, and then add the parts where the controls will attach, as I've done here. I don't think it's going to be too tricky whichever way you choose to do it. Then, this shaft goes into place. On the right side here, I add this little lever. You'll probably find tweezers to be helpful here. Then, because the instructions told me to, I assemble the seats, because I always do what the instructions tell me to. There are 4 seats, and they're pretty simple to put together. I then decided it was a good idea to install the floor part onto the lower hull. There's guides that make sure you probably won't mess it up too badly. Installing the 2 forward seats seemed like a sensible next step, and it was. I think you'll agree, they look rather seat. I then install this lever. I've no idea what it does. Probably nobody knows what it is. I follow that with a gear shifter. I then decided to add the wheels, which is really easy. I did have to do some minor kajiggering to some of the suspension units to get them to sit straight, which involved adding glue and a bit of pressure. Very careful pressure. The suspension may still be a little bit wonky, but they're not too bad. The instructions do want the wheels to be added a bit earlier than this, and in hindsight, I would suggest leaving them off until even later, especially if you want to fill the gaps in the rear wheel arches. It wasn't the worst thing to have them in place now though, so add them if you want, or leave them off if you want to paint them separately. Do what you want. I'm not your dad. Next, I assemble this rear seat thing. I figured adding this bracket, or maybe it's an armrest, whatever it is, I thought it might be helpful in determining the correct angle for these two parts. I figured there was no sense in leaving it sit around, so I installed it onto the hull, and it wasn't too difficult. I don't think this caused any of the fitting issues with the upper hull later on, but it is certainly worth being careful about. Then, why not add the rear seats? It's much better than having them sit loose and potentially fall victim to the carpet monster. This is the lower section of firewall, I guess you might call it, in the driver's compartment. I'm gluing the pedals into place here, though I'm not quite sure if I got the parts for the clutch and brake in the right place. They looked pretty much identical on the sprue, but one of them has a slightly longer shaft. It's not going to be very prominent anyway, so I didn't do anything to make sure that it was correct. Onto that assembly, I glue this thing. The arch here will fit over the transmission. Pretty simple. Then I take this upper dashboard part and glue this thing with various gauges onto it. You may need to apply some pressure, but you shouldn't have any troubles. Then I glue the previous assembly to the bottom of it. It's shaped such that you shouldn't have any issues getting it correctly lined up. This bracket then goes into place here. This will hold the steering column in place, so why not add that now? It easily slides into place and down into the mounting hole. The steering wheel can be left for later. For the front passenger, there's a little handle to hold onto when things get a bit wild. It's a little bit fiddly because of its size, but not too hard to install. And then, why not install the dashboard assembly into the upper hull? It's not difficult, though I did have to apply some pressure to eliminate some uninvited gaps. These internal wall parts go on next, and they should go on after the dashboard is in place. And then, I tried test fitting the two halves of the hull together. As you can probably see, the model wasn't exactly cooperating, which is probably not that bad a thing. Gluing it together at this point would have been a mistake. Not one of those mistakes where we chuckle and say, "Oh, Herbert, you silly dingaling." One where Herbert goes grrr and gets annoyed. Why would it be a mistake? This headlamp needs to go in place, though first it does need to be assembled, and once it's together, it gets slid into an enclosure, I guess you'd call it, which is then mounted on the inside of the hull. I'm sure most of you can see why that might be a problem if the hull had been glued together. The light enclosure assembly did need to be trimmed a bit before it would fit, but it did go into place. I did a bit of trimming and hacking of some of the internal parts of the upper hull, and eventually managed to get it to go together, though it did still need a fair bit of holding and pressure to minimize gaps. The end result is certainly not perfect. This area will definitely need some extra work before painting time. The main culprit that was keeping the parts from going together was the area above the rear suspension. I had no idea that it was going to be as annoying as it was, but at least I had the foresight to disobey the instructions and leave a lot of the external details off until the hull was together. A lot of that would have been broken if it was installed when the instructions said to. Anyway, now I install the rear deck, and this pretty much drops right into place. Then there's a little, I think it's a fuel cap. That would make sense, and I follow that with some more flooring, or decking, I guess would be the more appropriate word. It also drops right into place. And now, the doors. Not the band, unfortunately.
You should stop trying to be funny, Herbert.
I add this handle for holding, again probably for when the Schwimmwagen is being driven a bit wildly, and then the handle for opening the door. They're both small and therefore a bit fiddly, but not the hardest thing to install. There are also some external parts for the door, but I chose to leave them off until later to avoid damage. Next, I add this thing, which is a mount for a mirror, and another thing. While that's bonding, just in front of it I add a thing. Clearly, I don't know what it is. There's one for both sides. Then I start adding things to the mounting arm I just put on. The first thing, I think, is a horn. It does have a little guide knob, and the only thing really making it difficult is the small size. Same for this second thing, which I'm pretty sure is a mirror. I tried to position it in such a way that makes sense for a mirror. Number plate plates are probably somewhat important, so I'm adding those. These are pretty much just a strip of plastic, and there isn't really anything to guide them, so you've just got to kind of eyeball it. Mine are probably not perfectly straight and centered, but they do the job. On the left rear, I add this tail light, or at least that's what I think it is, and then on the left, a convoy light. And now for some clear parts. The left windshield panel is separate, so you could model it open, or as I've done, closed. That's well and good, but it was slightly annoying to get into place. At the risk of fogging things up, I'm using regular plastic cement here. The parts didn't fog up, but I was being careful not to use too much glue, and definitely not putting it on surfaces that need to stay clear. Do this kind of thing at your own risk, I suppose. These little, I guess they're hinge parts, whatever they are, they go on next, and I think I made a mistake while clipping these off the sprues and eliminated a protrusion which could have helped mount the windshield. The triangular side bits of window were a little bit more annoying to attach, mostly because there isn't really anything to guide the angle they should go on at. Well, not nothing. I used the hull where the windshield attaches as a kind of guide, which sounds easy in concept, and it is, kind of. It was a bit fiddly and annoying. Eventually I got that assembly together and set it aside. I think it's probably best to paint it separately. It just seems a bit easier to paint the opaque parts than it would be to mask everything for spraying. I also left the photo etch windshield wipers off, because it would probably be a bit easier to add them after painting. Let's return to the doors. There's I guess it's a trim along the top of the door. The guide pins make this pretty easy to get into the right place. I then glue the doors into position. This is also pretty easy, though if I had to do it again, I would probably try to install the hinge parts at the same time, just so that everything lines up nice and easy. Either way though, the doors are on. I added their external handles next, and with tweezers, it's not that hard to get them in place. The difficult thing is not touching them afterwards and knocking them out of place. Same goes for the headlamp at the front. The hinge parts I mentioned a moment ago come next. Their size does make it a bit tricky to get them into place, even more so if the door isn't in quite the right place. I then install what I figure is a bilge pump. I found it didn't quite fit into place against that whatever it is behind it, so I cut a small slice out of it to make it fit. You might build yours a bit better than me, so you may not have to do this. With the main pump thing in place, I add this handle, and I assume this is for manual pumping. I've no idea if this was also electric, or if you just always had to have a passenger with you if you wanted to pump water out of your Schwimmwagen. I add the steering wheel next because it has to go in at some point, why not now? And then this railing around the rear deck. It drops right into place, but it's a bit easier to do if you place it there rather than dropping it.
Oh, you're so funny, Herbert.
I know. And now for one of the more annoying parts of this kit, figuring out where the support arms for the folded down cover go. The instructions aren't especially clear here, and a better after drawing, the kind that shows how it looks when it goes together, would have been really helpful. The one provided was not. I muddled through it, and I think I got it right, or close enough. Then I installed the part. The little arm bits that hang down from the cover should slot into the slots in the sides of the hull here. The canvas part itself is shaped such that it should sit pretty nicely on the railing on the rear deck. I do apologise for the poor focus. You can probably see what I'm doing though. The canvas cover was rather annoying to do, but you've got to admit that it does look pretty good. The final thing to add is the ball-on-stick vehicle width markers. Pretty simple to put on. Now, we need to find out one important thing. Will it float? It seems like, yes, it does float. For a little while anyway. It didn't take that long for the bilge pump to be needed, and unfortunately, it is solid plastic and doesn't function as a pump. I guess if you putty the gaps in the rear wheel arches, and down the sides where the hull parts join, it would probably float a little better, or at least sink a bit slower. The front traps air so it doesn't sink completely, but now we know that it doesn't really float. We've all learned from this very important test. You're welcome. So that's it. The Schwimmwagen Trippel SG638 from Werk is now completed. Mostly. Obviously there's some putty work to do along the sides, and the windshield is only sitting in place, and the clear lenses for the headlights haven't been installed yet, for obvious reasons, but it is together enough that you can see how the kit builds up, and if you ask me, it builds up rather nicely, and I think it looks really good. I've got no idea how historically accurate it is, and I'm sure that's a big surprise, but it looks the part to me. The kit was mostly fun to build, though some parts were a little bit frustrating, such as trying to get the two halves of the hull together, the canvas cover, and the suspension was also a little bit fiddly and annoying, though none of those were enough to bring the build to a halt, and it's not a bad thing to have a bit of a challenge while building a kit. Also, in fairness, some of the problems I encountered could have been of my own making, rather than a problem with the kit itself. The build did take a little bit longer than I'd anticipated to complete, though to be fair, that is usually the case. Anyway, I think I'm waffling again, and have probably waffled enough for you to watch the model spin around quite a few times. So, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section below. I did build this model live on stream, a few streams really, so if you'd like to watch me build stuff like this live, check out my Twitch channel, which is linked below, or keep an eye out here on YouTube. I stream on both. Subscribe if you want. If you really like what I do, and you're able, support on Patreon or Ko-fi. I would certainly appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.